Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. Hi everyone, I hope you've all had a safe and healthy holiday season, even if it hasn't necessarily been the happiest for everyone. The holidays can be a tough time in our community, so just wanted to acknowledge that it's not always super pleasant for all of us, but I hope that whatever you did do, you stayed safe and happy and healthy, and that you were able to spend it with people that you care about. Before I jump into today's topic, since I've been absent for quite a while, I have a few life updates. If you're not interested though, and you want to skip straight into the topic, just jump ahead to the timestamp on the screen and just feel free to skip this part. Hi, it's been a minute. There's been a lot going on these past couple of months, and I've been struggling pretty hard with exhaustion and approaching burnout territory. Shortly after I filmed my last video about Trump being elected, I got sick with a norovirus and I ended up briefly in the hospital being treated for dehydration. After that, my grandmother, who my partner and I live with, got sick, and then my partner got sick. It took a couple of weeks for all of us to bounce back from that, and then I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD. A few weeks before getting sick, I had started a new job and I was struggling a lot to adjust to the new routine, which involves commuting to the office a few days a week. I'll be doing a video about this soon, but the enormity of the overwhelm that I was feeling, even though I'm really happy and grateful to have this job and I actually do enjoy it a lot, is what led me to seek out a diagnosis. But as I mentioned, I'll be doing a video about ADHD and neurodivergence soon, so more on that later. I was diagnosed just before the holidays, and then my partner and I went to Maryland to spend Christmas with their family. It was my first time meeting them in person, and we had a lovely time, and just when I thought everything was finally settling down, a couple of days after New Year's, my dog Bonsai was diagnosed with cancer. I've had him for 13 years since he was a little puppy, and he has been like my absolute rock through some of the most challenging times of my life. We're currently pursuing treatment options, and he's going to see the oncologist on Friday, but the prognosis isn't great, so this has been an incredibly difficult start to the new year, and I've had to seriously cut back on any and everything in my life that's not strictly related to survival in order to avoid burnout and its subsequent loss of functioning. So that's why I haven't been posting for a while. Just anything that is not strictly necessary has had to be cut out of my life. But I do have a bit of energy and time today, so I thought it was finally time to post this video that I've been working on for literally 2 months. Before I fully dive into today's topic, I'd like to note that the script for this video was read and vetted by a trans woman who I'm very close to, but who doesn't feel comfortable being fully out yet. I'd like to thank her for taking the time to read through it and for just being an amazing human being who I am privileged to know. I'm dedicating this to her and to trans people everywhere, especially those whose lives were tragically cut short by violence prompted by ignorance and misinformation. In their honor, I will be donating all of the revenue from my channel during the month of January to the Transgender Law Center, which is the biggest American transgender-led civil rights organization in the United States. They work hard to fight for the civil liberties of trans folk in the US, and they need support now more than ever. I'm going to leave a link in the description below to their website, so if you'd like to make a donation yourself, you can do so there. It's the post-holiday season now, and times are tough, and I know a lot of us can't afford to donate. If that's you, that's okay. Even just watching this video all the way through really helps, because the ad revenue generated from your view will go towards the donation. So thank you for sticking with it, and thank you as always for your support of this channel. Okay, so let's get into it. A couple of months ago, on November 20th, was Trans Day of Remembrance, which is a chance for the community to come together and remember the trans folk who have died as a result of violence or mental health struggles or not having access to gender-affirming care. I wanted to be able to have this video up and ready by then, but as I said in the intro, I unfortunately got sick and wasn't able to film it in time. But better late than never, and since this is such an important yet still weirdly divisive issue, I wanted to get this out there as soon as I could. In this video, I'm going to get into some of the science behind being trans and what researchers have found over the past couple of decades. Surprisingly, not a lot of people are familiar with this body of work, including other queer people. Science is not my forte, and I'm guessing for a lot of viewers of this channel, it isn't their forte either, so I'm going to make this part as straightforward as possible. After that, I'm going to use this science to debunk some of the common myths and scare tactics that are used to demonize trans people. And then we're going to talk about why all of this matters so much right now. So buckle in and let's get to it. The actual science behind being trans. The thing about science is that it's hard to communicate. What we think we know about how the world works and how things like sex and gender work is always changing because we're constantly learning new things and having to update our knowledge, assumptions, and best practices. On top of that, the internet, combined with a lack of education about critical thinking skills, has resulted in a lot of misinformation and distrust of science and of academic institutions in general. And honestly, academics themselves aren't doing much to alleviate this problem. Not because they're not interested in communicating their research and findings to the general public, most academics absolutely are, but because it can be really difficult to distill these ideas into easily digestible sound bites that the general public can actually consume. Attention spans are lower than ever, life is expensive and time-consuming, and most ordinary working people just don't have the time and energy to intellectually wrestle with difficult, often contradictory findings and data sets. Science is complex and ever-changing, and a lot of the time it seems like as soon as we think we know something about a subject, whatever we've found out is already outdated because even more has been learned about it. I don't know how to bridge this gap. I'm not a scientist and I don't know how to communicate science well. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to try and distill these very complicated, ever-changing concepts into something that hopefully makes a bit of sense. As you'll see in a minute, at a scientific level, even seemingly basic intuitive concepts like sex characteristics and gender become really, really complicated when we try to understand more about them. So let's start with the basics. Sex characteristics. One of the most common arguments that conservatives like to use to discredit trans people is that they're not really trans because biological sex is fixed at birth by our chromosomes, which can't ever be changed. They talk about how no amount of gender-affirming care can ever change someone's biological sex because they have a simplistic understanding about what biological sex actually is. But science tells us a very different story, and we're only just beginning to learn about all the different ways in which biological sex can manifest in our bodies and brains. The term sex characteristics is used to describe all of the things that tell us whether someone is male or female or something else. I'll get to that later. There are two types of sex characteristics, primary and secondary. Primary sex characteristics are those which are present at birth. This is where the chromosomes come in, as well as other more obvious things like genitals and reproductive organs. Secondary sex characteristics, on the other hand, are those which develop at puberty, like a deep voice, wide hips, facial hair, breasts, etc. When we meet other adults, we tend to make unconscious decisions about their sex based on their secondary sex characteristics, whereas we tend to assign sex to babies based on their primary sex characteristics because they haven't gone through puberty yet. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Not so fast. A very interesting thing that we've learned about sex and gender in recent years is that someone's primary and secondary sex characteristics don't always line up with their chromosomes. Characteristics that we consider female, like breasts, wider hips, ovaries, a vagina, estrogen, etc., don't always line up neatly with two X chromosomes. And characteristics that we consider male, like a penis, testosterone, broad shoulders, facial hair, and a deep voice, don't always line up neatly with an X and a Y. Instead of being a fixed binary, science is beginning to show us that biological sex is more of a spectrum, and we all exist on it to some degree. It's not just trans folk who don't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. It's actually quite common for many of us to not fully align with all the characteristics and expectations of our assigned sex either. For example, women with polycystic ovarian syndrome who have an excess of male hormones in their body aren't fully aligning with their chromosomal sex. Men with low testosterone aren't fully aligning with their chromosomal sex either. And neither are men who don't have a lot of facial hair or who have higher pitched voices. An article from Scientific American that came out in 2024 states that it's possible to be XX and mostly male in terms of anatomy, physiology, and psychology, just as it's possible to be XY and mostly female. Many of us learned in high school that our biological sex is determined by our chromosomes, full stop. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, this is a very simplistic way of understanding biological sex, and it's commonly used by transphobic people who argue that no matter to what extent someone medically transitions, they will always be the biological sex that they were born with because you can't change someone's chromosomes. A lot of us learned in biology class that two X chromosomes mean girl and one X and one Y chromosome means boy. But sometimes, and a lot more often than you would think, this doesn't tell the whole story. When we're taught something in school, we're given a very basic understanding of the subject with the intention that we can build on that knowledge later on as we go through more school. But not all of us do or can. The danger with taking a basic understanding like that and running with it without updating our knowledge first is that it can have very harmful consequences for a lot of people, as we'll see later on. What science is beginning to show us about biological sex and the experiences of trans folk is that part of being trans originates in utero. You may have heard that all fetuses start out as female, and that's somewhat but not technically true. More accurately, each embryo starts off as being neither male nor female, with a pair of protogonads that develop into either male or female gonads at 6 to 8 weeks of gestation. Fetal development is syncopated, meaning that a variety of genes and hormones come into play at different times and to varying degrees during pregnancy. Male sex differentiation begins when a gene on the Y chromosome, called the SRY gene, prompts the protogonads to turn into testes. The testes then start producing testosterone and androgens, which cause the fetus to develop a prostate, a scrotum, and penis. Without the SRY gene, the protogonads will automatically become ovaries that secrete estrogen, prompting the fetus to develop a uterus, vagina, and clitoris. Are you with me so far? Good, because here's where it gets a little more complicated. The SRY gene isn't always straightforward, and sometimes it can be missing or dysfunctional. When this happens, a fetus with XY chromosomes can fail to develop male anatomy and will be identified at birth as being female. Or it might show up on the X chromosome instead of the Y, which leads to an XX embryo developing male anatomy and will be identified at birth as a boy, even though its chromosomal sex is female. And that's not all. Other genetic variations can occur in utero aside from the SRY gene malfunctioning. There's a condition called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is when the cells of an embryo with XY chromosomes respond minimally, if at all, to the signals of male hormones. When this happens, the protogonads become testes and the fetus produces male hormones, but male anatomy doesn't develop. The baby is born looking female with a clitoris and a vagina, and in most cases will grow up feeling like she's a girl. This is technically an intersex trait, and in many cases may go undetected and undiagnosed for the entirety of a person's life. Physical and chromosomal sexual differentiation happens within the first 2 months of fetal development, but sexual differentiation in the brain happens much later, in the second trimester of pregnancy. This means that our genitals and brains are subjected to different environments of hormones, nutrients, medication, and other chemical substances several weeks apart in the womb that affect sexual differentiation. This results in different brain structures, which, as it turns out, are linked with gender identity. Side note, I know I'm always talking about how gender is a social construct, and it is. Gender is just a collection of stereotypes and expectations that we assign to each other based on our secondary sex characteristics. That's very true. It's also very true that science has shown us that there are patterns of structural differences in the brains of trans folk. One of the first studies ever done on these differences was conducted in 1995 by Dick Swab, a researcher at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience in Amsterdam. He and his team were the ones who found the differences in the hypothalamus and that the brains of trans people were structurally more like the brains of the sex they insisted they were, rather than the sex they were assigned at birth. And this is true both before and after taking hormones, so we know that it's not a result of hormone replacement therapy.
What is the neurobiology of transsexuality? It had to do with the person insisting from day one that they got the wrong body. And this was a landmark study, fabulously well done and controlled and replicated once since then, showing that what transsexualism used to be thought of is that people who think that they're a different gender than they actually are. What this study suggests is what transsexualism is about is people who got the wrong gendered body. And these are people who are chromosomally of one sex. In terms of their gonads, they're of that sex. In terms of their hormones, they're of that sex. In terms of their genitalia and their secondary sexual characteristics, they are of that sex. But they are insisting that's not who I really am. This part of the brain agrees with them.
What all of this means is that trans women typically have brains that look like the brains of cis women, and trans men have brains that look more like those of cis men. Other studies have also indicated that the brains of some trans people have unique structural differences from those of cis people, hinting that maybe biological sex isn't even binary at all, or at the very least, it's a lot more nuanced and complicated than we think. Swab and his team found that, just like cis women do, trans women have fewer cells associated with the regulator hormone somatostatin, which is responsible for regulating several bodily functions, specifically those associated with the GI tract. This initial study gave rise to a whole new field of research on sex and gender that we're continuing to build on. One of the studies that built on Swab's work was conducted by scientists in Spain, and they found that the brains of trans men who were assigned female at birth contained white matter in a structure that was neither typically male nor typically female. Ivanka Savic, a professor of neurology at Sweden's Karolinska Institute, conducted a follow-up study on the brains of trans men and found that they tend to have a weakened connection between the two areas of the brain that process the perception of self and one's own body. These connections seem to improve after trans men start hormone replacement therapy. To quote Swab himself, "People can only live a happy life if they can live the way their brain has been programmed, and the state should accept that and guarantee them the freedom to live that way so long as they don't harm others. You should have the freedom to live as a homosexual, a transsexual, a heterosexual, and be protected by the state." A little bit of outdated language and terms, but I wanted to quote him directly. Altogether, we're learning that the human brain is extremely complex, with diversity being the rule, not the exception. In fact, there is so much variability and so many different combinations of biological sex markers and characteristics that it's possible for our brains, our bodies, and our reproductive systems to all have different biological sexes at the same time. And the fluid, non-binary nature of biological sex isn't just found in humans. The ability to switch between different sexes is actually very common in nature. There are many examples of animals that can change their biological sex depending on their environment and circumstances. This comes from a genetic switch in brain cells that can toggle between sex-specific states when necessary. These findings call into question the idea of sex as being a fixed property, and they reinforce our understanding of biological sex as a spectrum. A very interesting study from the University of Rochester's Department of Biomedical Genetics found that a species of microscopic roundworm called C. elegans has two sexes, male and androgynous. The androgynous worms can self-fertilize but can also be mating partners for males. Male C. elegans typically prefer searching for mates over eating, partly because they can't smell food as well as the androgynous worms can. But if a male goes too long without eating, it can dial up its ability to smell food, acting more like an androgynous worm. Worms are not humans, but these findings are still important because they indicate that at a molecular level, sex isn't binary or static. It's dynamic and flexible, and according to Dr. Douglas Portman, who led the research on C. elegans, the new results suggest that aspects of the male nervous system might transiently take on a female state, allowing male behavior to be flexible according to internal and external conditions. Geneticist Jacques Monod famously quipped that, "What's true of E. coli is true of an elephant." What he means by this is that genes have been conserved over time and among species, and the basic biochemistry of every living organism is remarkably similar at the molecular level. We can extrapolate from this and hypothesize that what's true for C. elegans could also be true for humans. All of this scientific evidence adds nuance to the idea that biological sex is fixed by our chromosomes and can't ever be changed. It's easy to assume this if you haven't read the latest research, and why would you unless it's directly relevant to your life? Most of us go about our days without ever giving a thought to our sex or gender, unless we happen to be trans and it's a source of discomfort and dysphoria, or if you happen to be close to a trans person and want to be a good ally. Conservatives tend to lean heavily into the idea that genitals and chromosomes are determined by our biological sex and can't ever be changed. But does it really make sense to give DNA and body parts primacy over the sentient, conscious brains that are experiencing sex and gender differently? If someone experiences their sex and gender as being different from the one that they were assigned at birth, they're expressing that their brains and bodies don't align. And as I've just shown you through all the examples and research, science backs this up. This is a real measurable phenomenon, and it's a lot more common than you'd think. Sex versus gender. Trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people are a very normal part of a long history of humanity that goes back to when we were hunter-gatherers. They've always been present in pretty much every community and corner of society. Gender is different from biological sex, and it's an amalgamation of a bunch of different factors, including chromosomes, anatomy, hormones, psychology, and culture. Whereas sex exists in the brain, body, and DNA, as we've seen in the previous section, gender exists as both an experience and an identity. For many of us, identities are fixed. They remain unchanging throughout our lives. For example, someone may identify as being Asian or white, and that tends to be a fixed property that doesn't change. For most people, their experience of gender remains fixed and constant in much the same way because it aligns with whatever sex they were assigned at birth. This is why it's so easy to confuse sex with gender and assume that it's the same thing. But they're not the same thing, and even though they're statistically a minority, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people still exist in huge numbers, somewhere between 10 and 15 million in the US alone as of 2022. And that's probably an underestimation. Like anything, as we learn more about what gender is and is not, more and more people are recognizing their own experiences within our expanding knowledge base. If you're watching this right now, pause this video and take a moment to ask yourself what your gender is. Really ask yourself that question. How do you know that your gender is what it is? What factors make you feel like your gender? Is it how you feel in your body, the clothing and aesthetic styles that you feel drawn to, the way that you naturally think, feel, and behave? Is it how others see you and interact with you? Where does your gender come from? Can you feel it anywhere in your body? Pause this video, close your eyes, and meditate on this for a moment. There are no right or wrong answers, just your own unique perception and experiences. If you did this exercise, my guess is that you struggled with it a bit, and that's totally normal. All of us struggle to really pin down our gender on some level because gender is complex and fluid for everyone. It depends on so many different things, and it's almost impossible for all of those things to line up neatly 100% of the time. Even if you do feel like the gender you identify with 100% of the time, the factors that make you feel that way are still dynamic and ever-changing. One day you might feel like a woman because of the clothes you're wearing, and the next day you may feel like a woman because you got your period. One day you might feel like a man because a pretty girl asked you to reach something down from a high shelf for her, and the next day you might feel like a man because you did 100 reps at the gym and can finally see some muscle gains. Those are very basic stereotypical examples, but I think you get my point. If you're cis, what makes you feel like the gender you are can and does change all the time, even if your gendered identity itself never changes. If you're not cis, the factors that make you feel like a different gender than the one you were assigned at birth are also complex and ever-changing. It's important to understand that gender identity is different from gender expression. Identity is defined as how an individual perceives themselves and what they call themselves. How someone identifies is always irrevocably 100% up to them. There is no objective measure of identity because identity, by definition, is subjective. It's the same thing with gender. You can't tell someone that they're not really the gender they are just because they might not be expressing it in the same way that you would or in a way that you expect them to. That would be like telling someone who loves cilantro that they're wrong about it tasting good because to you, cilantro tastes like soap. Someone's experience of their gender is always subjectively correct because it's their experience, regardless of whether or not they choose to outwardly express those experiences. Gender expression refers to the outward appearance of someone's gender identity, which is usually conveyed through clothing, behavior, and tone of voice. Someone's gender expression may or may not conform with society's expectations, and it may or may not even conform to their own gender identity or their sex assigned at birth. For example, I am a cis woman. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman. However, from time to time, I like to dress in clothes that look more masculine and take on more of a traditionally masculine role in my relationship, like opening doors for my partner and being big spoon. When I do this, some parts of my gender expression change, but my gender identity does not. Like many queer women, my gender expression is a bit more fluid, even if my gender identity is fixed. Even when I'm looking or behaving in more masculine ways, I still feel like a woman and still experience myself as being a woman. Drag queens are another example of how gender expression and gender identity can be different. If a cis man dresses in drag and presents himself as a woman, he is still a cis man even while looking and behaving like a woman. On the other hand, let's take the example of someone who was assigned male at birth but realizes they're trans. They're still trans regardless of whether or not their gender expression aligns with society's expectations. A trans woman who realizes she's trans but then continues to present herself in more masculine ways may do so for reasons of safety or because she's not finished transitioning or because she has other intersecting queer identities or for any reason at all. She's still a woman because that's how she experiences herself and the world. We can't see that from the outside though, which is why we're always saying that you can't assume someone's gender just by looking at them. We simply don't know how someone identifies until and unless we ask them because it's possible for someone's gender expression to be different from their gender identity. To further complicate things, the culture we grow up in has a lot to do with how both our gender identities and expressions are shaped. In every culture, there are people whose gender identity doesn't match their assigned sex, and depending on how much pressure their culture puts on them to conform to traditional gender roles, this incongruence can cause a lot of psychological distress. Many non-Western cultures make space for a variety of gender expressions and identities. This most often takes the form of a third gender and sometimes even a fourth or fifth gender. I talked about this a bit in my video about the origins of patriarchy, but basically the gender binary tends to be fairly localized to Western Judeo-Christian culture. Many Native American cultures in the eastern part of the US and Canada have a socially recognized third gender, and those who identify as that third gender are seen as having two spirits. Just like there are traditional gender roles for men and women in Western Christian society, there are traditional gender roles for two-spirit individuals as well, which can differ between cultures, but generally entail special responsibilities around childbirth and shamanism, as they're thought to have a closer connection to spirits. The Bugis or Bugis, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, of Indonesia recognize 4 different genders, which include cis men, cis women, transgender individuals, and Bisu, who are considered half male and half female. Bisu can be intersex but don't have to be. They're thought of as being externally male but internally female, meaning that they present with male bodies but have the thoughts, feelings, and spirit of a woman. Their gender role is to be shamans, as they're believed to have a special connection to the gods. Much of the problem with traditional gender roles in Western society is that there are only 2 of them. This is narrow and confining, and it excludes huge swaths of the population who are neither strictly male nor strictly female, and therefore don't have an official place in the existing social structure. This binary view of sex and gender that we have in our culture can contribute to gender dysphoria, although it's far from being the only contributing factor. Gender dysphoria, for those of you watching who might not be familiar with the term, is defined as psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. In some cases, the anxiety and depression caused by gender dysphoria can become life-threatening if left untreated. No one knows exactly where gender dysphoria comes from, although it's likely a combination of factors that include hormones in the womb during gestation, genes, environment, and cultural factors like the ones I just talked about. Every trans person's experience of gender dysphoria is different, and it can range from mild to extreme. The only treatment for gender dysphoria that we know of at this moment in time is gender-affirming care, and the sooner it can be provided, the better the outcomes for the individual. Pop singer Kim Petras made international news in 2006 when, at the age of 13, she appeared on a German talk show to discuss her experience of being trans. At age 14, she appeared in a documentary and another talk show to raise awareness of the importance of gender-affirming care and to advocate for herself and other trans kids who need to medically transition before the legally sanctioned age of 18 because they were experiencing severe and life-threatening gender dysphoria. In Germany, where she lived, medically transitioning wasn't allowed until the age of 18, which is typically after puberty. I'll expand on this more in the next section, but basically we know that using hormone blockers before puberty sets in results in better outcomes, particularly for trans women. Kim Petras' gender dysphoria was so intense, however, that she was in danger of seriously harming herself, and at the age of 16, after a years-long battle, she was finally approved for gender-affirming surgery, which was deemed a medical necessity for her.
Since I was born, basically, I couldn't identify as a boy. I was just really, really sad. I told my parents, like, as soon as I could speak, basically, that I felt like a girl. Then with like 12, I got hormone therapy, which meant for me that I got to be like a totally normal teenager and go through normal puberty. Everything went really, really great. Then I had the surgery and I was like, okay, I feel like myself now. I didn't hate my body anymore. The suicide rate is so high, which I get. Like, I felt really suicidal as a kid, and I was like, I don't want to live if I have to live with the wrong gender. There's always been transgender people. It goes like way back in history. It's always happened. I don't know. People just have all these like ideas of it, and it's just like a totally normal thing.
I suspect that a lot of the hysteria in the US about schools performing sex change operations on kids is the result of a broken game of telephone about Kim Petras' story, but that's a working hypothesis, and I don't actually have any proof of this. Editing Megan here. Somehow my camera wasn't on during the next couple of sections that I filmed, so I'm just gonna do them now just like this because I can't be bothered to set up the camera again, so you're just gonna have to deal with this. Sorry. What I was going to say in the next section is that being trans is a normal, healthy part of human diversity, both biologically and culturally. Unfortunately, though, instead of celebrating that diversity and listening to trans people and learning from their experiences, as a society, we are leaning hard into scapegoating and ignorance and violence and perpetuating stereotypes that are ignorant and harmful. In this next section, I'm going to reiterate some of these stereotypes and then debunk some of the myths and conspiracy theories that you may have heard about trans people using science. Myth: puberty blockers are dangerous. Conservative talking heads have been trying to make the case that puberty blockers are dangerous because they cause severe depression, anxiety, and infertility later in life. None of those things are actually true. Weaponizing parents' anxieties about the safety and well-being of their kids is part of the fascist playbook because fear is a powerful emotion that can be manipulated to serve the interests of those in power. If you're a parent and you're watching this right now and you're afraid that your kid might be trans and that they might ask you for puberty blockers one day, then you'll definitely want to listen to this because I'm going to try to alleviate some of that fear for you. Truth: puberty blockers are safe and effective. Originally developed as a treatment for precocious puberty, a condition where kids physically mature faster than is safe or that they're emotionally ready for, puberty blockers are drugs that postpone puberty by suppressing the release of gonadotrophins that start the process of sexual maturation. Puberty blockers have been in use since the 1980s, and the side effects have been well studied and extensively documented over the past 40 years. Many of these studies are longitudinal, meaning that kids who went on puberty blockers back in the 80s when they were new were then followed up with later in life by doctors looking to document any potential long-term side effects. They found none. Results from these studies have shown repeatedly that the only time puberty blockers are at risk of causing lasting harm is if they continue to be taken after puberty, which no credible doctor would sanction in the first place. Otherwise, the side effects are very mild, to the tune of swelling at the injection site, headaches, and hot flashes. What this all means is that puberty blockers are safe and effective, and once they're no longer administered, gonadotrophin is released in the body as usual and puberty begins as normal. At the time of filming this video, there are 4 different puberty blockers currently in use. Number 1, Lupron, which is a monthly or once every 3 months intramuscular injection of leuprolide. Fensolvi, another form of leuprolide that's injected under the skin once every 6 months. Triptodor, a form of triptorelin, which is given as an injection every 6 months. And Suprelin, which is an annual surgical implant. Although gender-affirming care is supported by all the major medical associations in the US, conservatives are manufacturing a lot of hysteria right now, especially around giving trans kids surgeries and hormones. In most places, these levels of gender-affirming care actually only happen after careful consultation with doctors and care teams, and they require formal psychological assessment by a mental health professional to determine the severity of gender dysphoria before someone can even see a gender-affirming physician. There's also a lot of waiting involved in between each step of the process because in many places there are long wait lists for specialists who provide gender-affirming care. If you do have a trans kid, they're already suffering from depression and anxiety, among other things. Like everything else when it comes to medical interventions, you have to weigh out the risks and benefits, and nothing is 100% free of side effects or the potential for complications. However, letting your kid experience gender dysphoria, bullying, and a lifetime of trying to transition after puberty is guaranteed to do way more damage than any potential side effects of puberty blockers. In the case of trans women, it's especially difficult to force them to go through male puberty because the changes that testosterone makes to the body during puberty are permanent and very difficult to undo later in life. At the root of the problem, and a lot of the problems we have as a society around issues of gender and diversity, is a tendency to simply not believe people when they tell us who they are or when they have experiences that are different from ours. This also applies to invisible disabilities and neurodivergence, but I'll be talking about that in my next video, don't you worry. We often think that we know people better than they know themselves, and this is especially true when it comes to kids. If you're worried that a teenager might not know themselves well enough to make choices about their gender, it may help to think of puberty blockers as a kind of hormonal Hoover dam that holds back puberty just long enough for kids who think they might be trans to have some extra time to figure themselves out. If it turns out that it's just a phase, then they can stop taking puberty blockers and they'll undergo the type of puberty that aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth, and way hey and away they go. Way, hey, away. But if it turns out they really are trans, then as soon as they're old enough, they can begin the process of medically transitioning if that's what they want to do. And being on puberty blockers will have made that process so much easier and safer and healthier. Transitioning after puberty often involves expensive surgeries, and in the case of trans women, voice training and hair removal processes, which can be painful and time-consuming and, did I mention, expensive. For trans women in particular, medically transitioning can also be an important safety measure. In places where it's not safe to be visibly trans, it's even more important to be able to pass, and transitioning after puberty makes that much, much harder. If you were the parent of a trans kid and you could spare them that kind of pain, expense, and potential danger later on in life, wouldn't you want to do that? Wouldn't it be worth the risk of very mild potential side effects of puberty blockers? Isn't it much better to risk some mild discomfort now than guarantee them a lifetime of mental anguish, physical torture, and potentially even the risk of violence and self-harm? I'm not a mother, and I thankfully never will be, but if I had a kid and my kid came to me one day and told me that they think they might be trans, I would whisk their little butt straight into the chair of a child psychologist for assessment to figure out the extent of their gender dysphoria, and then I would put them on puberty blockers immediately. Myth: being trans is a social contagion. This is a conspiracy theory that conservative talking heads like to perpetuate. Bill Maher and Jordan Peterson are notorious for spewing this garbage all over the talk shows and the internet.
Yes, part of the rise in LGBT numbers is from people feeling free enough to tell it to a pollster. But some of it is, it's trendy. Penis equals man? Okay, boomer.
So they go on the internet and they're told that all of their problems will be solved if they become a man.
So you worry that there could be a sort of social contagion element of this?
Where lazy, disenfranchised men then run with it and use it to justify their own misogyny and transphobia. The argument goes something like this. So many people are coming out now as trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming, and it's mostly young girls who are doing it, and that's because they're spending too much time on TikTok being influenced by their peers. At the heart of this argument is the seething misogyny that assumes women, especially young women, are deeply unserious and don't know their own minds. Unconsciously and sometimes consciously, it goes something like this. Look at these silly young women with their bad pop music and their obsession with social media appearances. They're so annoying, they giggle too much, and they'll just go along with whatever their friends are doing because all they care about is fitting in. They can't think for themselves. If this is how someone views young women and women in general, of course they're not going to believe a teenage girl when she says she's really a boy, or that her gender changes, or that she has no gender at all. But the problem is the person who thinks this way, not the person who's expressing their identity. Truth. As we learn more, we find more. As we learn new things, we discover more of them. That's true of a lot of things, not just gender. Take neurodivergence, for example. When I was growing up, unless you were a boy who just couldn't sit still, you would have never been diagnosed with ADHD or even suspected of having it. Now, adult women are being diagnosed with ADHD and autism en masse because more research has been done in recent years to understand how neurodivergence shows up differently in girls and women, largely because of how we're socialized differently from boys, and a lot of women are recognizing these traits in themselves and seeking a diagnosis. Learning more about things typically expands the criteria that we use to define them, and as these criteria expand and grow, they're naturally going to include more and more people. As we learn more about how the mechanisms of biological sex and gender work on a chemical, genetic, physical, and social level, more and more people are recognizing that there's a word for how they've been feeling their whole lives and recognizing these traits in themselves. This isn't social contagion, it's a result of having more accurate information that helps you understand yourself better so that you can more accurately describe and understand your experiences and then connect with others who are similar to you. Myth: trans women shouldn't compete in women's sports. This is personally one of my favorites. There's a lot of hullabaloo about trans women competing against cis women in sports, and the fear is that trans women will have an unfair advantage due to being assigned male at birth. Whenever I hear someone griping about trans women playing on women's sports teams, my first thought is A, who gives a flying fuck? We're talking about a game here. And B, you've obviously never met a trans woman before. Truth: trans women are a lot more like cis women than they are like cis men. Just like testosterone has physical effects on the body, so does estrogen. Hormone replacement therapy for trans women involves taking anti-androgens that block male hormones and the addition of estrogen and eventually progesterone. This combination can soften the skin, shrink feet, reduce height, redistribute body fat, and deteriorate muscle mass. So not only are trans women taking female hormones that are rapidly changing how their bodies look, feel, and behave, they're also actively removing all of the male hormones in their bodies that would be responsible for giving them any sort of perceived physical advantage in the first place. If anything, trans women are at a disadvantage even on women's teams because they're essentially going through second puberty, which makes the body a little more fragile and vulnerable. Myth: trans women shouldn't use women's restrooms. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists like J.K. Rowling and her army of out-of-touch boomer Karens are fond of scaring us into believing that trans women are invading women's spaces and crowding us out. Or something like that. To be honest, I don't really understand this one because it's stupid. Not that the other ones aren't also stupid, this one is just egregiously stupid. Truth: trans women are women who belong in women's spaces. This whole scare tactic is based on the assumption that biological sex is fixed by chromosomes and doesn't change ever, no matter what your gender identity or expression is. And as we've just explored in the previous section, biological sex is complicated and nuanced. The only marginally intelligent thing Matt Walsh ever said was when he asked the question, what is a woman?
I just wanted to know, what is a woman?
And you're not going to find out.
And even then, he managed to leave out the other half of the question, which is, and what is a man? What even is biological sex? We just don't really know, bottom line. All we know is that it's complicated. If someone says they're a woman and that's their gender, then they're a woman. That's how they experience the world, and that means they're subjected to all the same psychological bullshit that all women are subjected to in this patriarchal, heteronormative hellscape. And that means they belong in women's spaces, if only to get some goddamn peace and quiet away from all the men for a couple of minutes. And that includes women's bathrooms. To the TERFs and other conservatives who say that trans women shouldn't be in women's bathrooms because they were assigned male at birth, I pose the following question. What about trans men then? Where would you have them go to the bathroom? I wonder how a TERF or a transphobe would react if a big, burly, bearded man was forced to share the washroom with them because he had been assigned female at birth.
I feel like there's a major epidemic amongst all transphobes, and that is the fact that they all need to see an optometrist. So I've taken the liberty of doing a step-by-step process of how you can see one in your local area. 1. Go to Google on your browser of choice. 2. Type in optometrist. 3. Go see one. And 4. Come back and tell me if I still look like a girl to you. Bye.
Myth: trans people are groomers. This one is related to the social contagion myth. At the heart of both of these is the incorrect assumption that being trans is a choice. It isn't, as we've already seen, and this one applies to all queer people too. The groomer panic that conservatives like to stir up around the LGBTQA+ community is a conspiracy theory, and it's not new. Grooming, in broad strokes, is defined as the actions an adult takes to make a child vulnerable to sexual abuse. More recently, it's been used by far-right politicians like Ron DeSantis to pass homophobic and transphobic legislation like Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. An article from Open Mind that was published in May of 2022 sums up the groomer panic much better than I ever could. Some media pundits make it sound as if we are in the midst of a pandemic of transgender, non-binary, and other gender non-conforming people invading our communities and threatening the young. But the real threat is misinformation and disinformation about sex, gender, and sexuality, a war of words that scrambles a simple scientific fact. Gender variation among humans has always been the norm. The only thing that has changed is that people are now discussing this reality more openly and honestly. You can no more groom someone into being trans than you can groom someone into developing a birthmark. We live in a culture that pushes heterosexuality on everyone all the time from the cradle to the grave, and yet trans and queer kids still exist. They grow up surrounded by enormous pressure to be heteronormative, yet that pressure doesn't erase their queerness, it just encourages them to suppress it. Flip the script, and the same is true for cis and straight kids. You can inundate them with stories and information about trans and queer folk, but it won't erase their straightness if they're legitimately straight. That's literally why conversion therapy doesn't work. Truth: talking to kids about sex and gender isn't grooming. In fact, it's healthy, normal, and necessary, and you can and should do it in age-appropriate ways that don't expose kids to the things they're not psychologically or emotionally ready for. For example, telling a 5-year-old that 2 women or 2 men can fall in love and get married just the same as a man and a woman can is healthy and appropriate. You can and should do that without talking about the actual mechanics of how lesbians or gay men have sex. You can always build on those basic concepts as the child gets older, but the point of talking to children about sex and gender when they're very young is so that they can have the opportunity to grow up knowing that diverse sexual, romantic, and gender orientations are healthy and normal, and should one of those apply to them, it will greatly reduce their internalized shame, self-loathing, and risk of self-harm. Someone recently commented on one of my videos that they want their daughter to stay innocent for as long as possible, so they were going to make sure she didn't find out about sex until she was 18. I responded immediately and encouraged them to talk to their daughter about sex as soon as she was school-aged, because she's going to hear it on the playground, and trust me, you do not want your kid finding out about sex from other kids. And they will find out about sex from other kids who are going to give them all sorts of ideas that they won't know what to do with. Wouldn't you as a parent prefer to be in control of that information? Isn't it better that your kid learns about what sex is from you and not from some kid who you don't know and whose parents you may or may not know? I found out about sex when I was 7 years old, and I remember it very well. Some boy on the playground talked about it at recess one day and made a crude gesture, and that night in the car on the way home from ballet class, I asked my mom what sex was. She responded very calmly and said it was something that grown-ups do, and if I'm curious about it, she and dad would talk to me about it on the weekend. So the following Saturday night, after my 2 younger siblings had gone to sleep, my mom and dad sat down with me at the kitchen table. They had bought a bag of my favorite chips for us to snack on, and my mom made hot chocolate. My dad brought out an anatomy textbook, and they explained to me in very clinical terms what sex is and how it works. I remember being super embarrassed and grossed out, and my mom told me that it was okay to feel that way about it right now, and that one day I might change my mind, but if I never did, that was okay too. I didn't learn about queer people until several years later when I was in middle school at a youth group event of all places. My youth ministers talked to us about the LGBTQIA+ community and told us that there were members of our congregation who were queer and that being queer is a beautiful and healthy thing. And that was that. None of this made me into some kind of sex addict. I am in fact asexual in spite of the fact that I learned about sex when I was 7 years old. And I didn't realize I was queer until just a couple of years ago in my early 30s, in spite of the fact that I was educated about queer people in middle school. I always thought that being queer was for other people, not for me. Dr. Jill Weber, a psychologist based out of Washington, D.C., recommends talking to your children about sex as soon as they start asking questions about it. She advises having a series of talks about it, each one building on the last as your child gets older, and in a really great article from Psychology Today, she provides 5 handy talking points to get those conversations going in healthy and age-appropriate ways. She also outlines the emotional and psychological benefits of talking to your kids about sex, most obvious among them that it can build a deeper and more trusting bond between you and your child. I'll link to the article in the description below. It's really good. On the whole, child psychologists recommend talking to your kids about sex and relationships and not letting them find out on their own, or worse, from other kids or the internet. That's not grooming, that's healthy parenting and good education, and schools should be providing that education as well for all the same reasons. It sets kids up for better and healthier relationships as adults, both with themselves and others, and it mitigates the risk of them picking up unhealthy ideas and habits around sex from the world around them. Myth: trans people will regret their transition. Trans people who regret transitioning have been pushed into the public eye a lot in recent years. Transphobic influencers like Blair White and Matt Walsh have interviewed people on their respective platforms who are detransitioning to try and make it seem like there are way more people who regret transitioning than there actually are.
This need that I feel to highlight the stories of detransitioners.
This is just an attempt to delegitimize trans people and make it seem like they're crazy or don't know who they are and what they want, or that trans people don't even really exist, or that transitioning shouldn't be allowed because it's harmful. It's not harmful, and like I've said many times in this video, medically transitioning can be and is a life-saving process. Truth: very few people actually regret transitioning. According to statistics that were gathered on detransitioners in 2022, only 3% of trans people experience some form of regret about transitioning, and this is mostly due to social pressure to not be trans. The world isn't safe for trans people right now, especially trans women, and most people who do regret their transition regret it for those reasons, not because it wasn't the right decision for them. Dr. Jack Turbin, a child psychologist and director of the gender psychiatry program at the University of California, San Francisco, conducted a study on detransitioners in 2022 and found that 90% of people in the US who return to their gender assigned at birth don't detransition because of regret or dissatisfaction, but because of pressure from work, school, family, or society in general. This means that almost all people who detransition are just shoving themselves back into the closet. They're still trans. They were born trans and will always be trans. They just felt it was better to go back to pretending to be someone they're not, even though it might destroy their mental and physical health, because the social pressure to not be trans was that intense. If Matt Walsh and Blair White and their followers are really concerned about the health and well-being of detransitioners, they would be helping to make society a better and safer place for trans people so that they don't feel like it's safer or easier to go back into the closet. Instead, they're pretending to care about detransitioners, using these people's very real anguish and pain to prop up their grifts and boost their own platforms. To give you an example, there's a Russian politician who also happens to be a trans woman who came out, reversed, and then came out again because she couldn't stay in the closet. She went back into the closet initially because she didn't feel safe being out, not because she regretted her transition. Her story is really, really interesting, and I'll link it down below in the description for those of you who want to read it. Myth: trans people need to make an effort to pass as their preferred gender, otherwise they're not really trans. I covered this one already a little bit earlier in this video, but I want to touch on it again because it's a myth that gets circulated a lot in center-right circles among people who may accept that trans people exist and adopt a position of live and let live, but are not interested in good information or active allyship. For whatever reason, some people seem to think that trans people owe them medical transitioning. They think that if someone isn't adequately passing as the gender they identify as, they're not really trans. I know a couple of people who think like this, and they would never describe themselves as being transphobic, but this is absolutely a transphobic stance to take. It comes from the deeply ingrained and unconscious belief that if someone deviates from the norm in some way, they have to really lean into it, or else their deviation is not legitimate. It's similar to invisible disabilities like major depression or OCD in that you have to work extra hard to prove something is real when other people can't see it. In the case of trans folk, it's an extension of compulsory heterosexuality because our society assumes that everyone is straight and cis by default, and those who aren't have to work really hard to prove it in order to be accepted and believed. Truth: once again, gender identity is different from gender expression. Here's the thing, trans people don't owe us anything, and it is completely up to each individual whether or not they want to medically transition or to what extent they want to medically transition, and much of that depends on the extent and severity of the gender dysphoria that they're experiencing, combined with how safe it is to not pass as their identified gender in their communities. Medically transitioning involves a combination of hormone replacement therapy, surgery, and sometimes counseling. There is a wide range of surgeries available for trans folk, including top and bottom surgeries, and for trans women, facial feminization, as well as a new type of surgery that can give trans women bigger hips. Like any type of surgery, these all come with risks. Additionally, medically transitioning can be expensive and time-consuming. It can take several years before someone fully passes, and the in-between time can be awkward, uncomfortable, and potentially even dangerous, depending on where you live. A trans person is still trans whether or not they choose to medically transition. If someone identifies as trans, it's important to believe them. They're not confused or misguided. They're not falling prey to social contagion. They're not lying for attention. They're expressing that they're looking out at the world and experiencing life from their viewpoint as the gender they feel most aligned with, regardless of how their face and body look to everyone else. I've said this already in my video, but it bears repeating. We do not have the authority to tell people what they're experiencing and how they experience it based on what we see from the outside. Remember in elementary school when we were all taught to not judge a book by its cover? This simple but timeless lesson is all you really need when it comes to interacting with trans folk or really anyone. Believe people when they tell you who they are. Trans and queer people don't have an agenda. We're not trying to groom your kids. All we want is for kids to grow up knowing that it's okay and healthy to be who they are and love who they love. All we want is to give them the opportunity to grow up in a world where being trans or being queer is perfectly normal and not a big deal because a lot of us never had that chance. Like any adult who loves children, we just want all the queer and trans kids out there to have opportunities for safety and acceptance and love that we never did. Final thoughts. Education is something that doesn't stop when you leave school. Whether that's after middle school, high school, 4 years of university, or all the way up to a PhD, we can't and shouldn't stop learning because there are always new things to learn. We all learned in middle school that girls have 2 X chromosomes and boys have an X and a Y chromosome, and this is fixed and unchanging, and it's the final boss of what differentiates the two sexes. Those who stopped learning right there, who never bothered to update their knowledge, are missing out on a whole bigger picture that has the power to potentially change how they see the world and interact with others. Of course, we can't be constantly updating our knowledge about everything all the time. We're not operating systems, and our brains aren't built for a steady stream of new information either. I have no idea what the ideal balance is between too much information and not enough, or how to achieve that. But I'm inclined to think that when people's safety and sometimes even their lives depend on us learning new things and becoming a bit more flexible in our thinking, then maybe it's time to expand our knowledge a little bit. When ignorance begins to shape public policy, when entire populations are being scapegoated by fascist leaders with an agenda to stay in power, then maybe it's a good indicator to learn a little bit more about the experiences and subjectivities of those who are being marginalized. Maybe. What do I know? I wanted to end off this video by listing the names of trans people who have been killed for being trans, but tragically there are so many that it would take a whole series of videos just to tell the bare bones of all their stories. So instead, I'm going to leave you with some stats that were compiled by an organization called Trans Respect vs. Transphobia Worldwide. Every year, they track how many trans people were murdered that year, and then they publish their findings on November 20th, the Worldwide Day of Trans Remembrance. Since 2008, when they first started gathering data, more than 4,600 trans people have been murdered worldwide. In 2023, 320 trans and gender non-conforming people were killed. 94% of those killed were trans women, and 80% of those were trans women of color, which is a 15% increase from 2022. Most of them were young. The age group that saw the most violence was 19 to 25. Overall, those between 19 and 40 years old made up 77% of those who were killed, almost 3/4. Almost 3/4 of all those deaths happened in Latin America and the Caribbean, with 31% of them happening in Brazil. Armenia, Belgium, and Slovakia reported murders of trans people for the first time in 2023. All of these stats have been steadily increasing year over year. They're alarming, but they don't drive home the real human impact of transphobic conspiracy theories that are allowed to metastasize unchecked all over the internet and then leak into public policy. So with that in mind, I want to tell you a little story. Trigger warning for transphobia, murder, and violence. Brianna Gay was a 16-year-old trans girl growing up in the UK. She was a TikTok influencer and passionate advocate for other trans kids, mentoring them and helping them navigate the system to access gender-affirming care. She was also autistic and had ADHD, which her mother later said had always made it difficult for her to identify dangerous situations. On February 11th, 2023, Brianna was brutally murdered by two of her classmates who had befriended her when no one else would. One weekend, they lured her out to meet them in the woods to hang out, and despite her anxiety about taking the bus by herself, Brianna braved public transit to go out and spend time with her new friends. She would never come home. Her body was found in the woods by a woman walking her dog. The woman called 999, asking for police and an ambulance, and minutes later, Brianna was declared dead at the scene. Her killers were caught and given life sentences, and her story is a tragic example of the real-world consequences of far-right grifters who use transphobia to manipulate the masses so that they can stay in power. Make people afraid and they'll follow you. Give people a scapegoat to blame all their problems on, and you can rush in and be the savior, and they'll gladly hand over their civil rights and freedoms in exchange for protection. That's how fascist leaders like Trump and Putin operate, and right now, trans people are the handy scapegoat, particularly trans women and girls. Trans girls like Brianna, who are hurting no one and are helping others, who are making the world a better place just by being in it. This has been a very long and somewhat depressing video, so I want to end it with a bit of hope and positivity. The good news is that there's a lot we can do to fight back, and it doesn't even take much time or effort. If you've watched this video all the way through to the end, thank you. That's already doing a lot to help, because hopefully you've picked up some useful information that you can think about and carry forward. You don't have to go marching in a rally or join an organization or lobby your local government to stand up to transphobic legislation in order to make a difference. Certainly those things do make a huge difference, and if you feel motivated to do them, then so much the better. But you can also have a big impact through small actions. Learn about the perspectives and experiences of trans people. They're not a monolith, and everyone is different. There are some fantastic trans creators here on YouTube, like Jamie Dodger, ContraPoints, Jessie Gender, and Sam Collins. Watch their videos, support their content, subscribe to their channels. I'll leave links to all their channels down below. Shop at businesses owned by trans people. In the US, around 30% of trans people live in poverty, and that statistic is likely to get worse in the coming years as trans people are increasingly marginalized. I'll include some links below to trans-owned businesses in Canada and the US where it's especially important to support trans folk right now. And on that note, I want to give a special shout out to my friend Kat, who is an artist and creator here in my hometown in Canada, who is also a trans woman and fantastically talented. And I'm going to link to her online shop below. She creates some amazing artwork in a variety of different mediums. So if you want to support a trans woman directly here in our community, if you happen to live in Ontario, definitely go check out her artwork. She is fantastic. If you didn't receive any formal education around critical thinking skills, take a bit of time to learn what they are and how to practice them. Not only will this make you smarter, safer, and more aware of the world around you, it will actively make the world a safer place for everyone, because that's what's going to stop dangerous conspiracy theories in their tracks. Learning critical thinking skills is surprisingly easy, and it'll help you sift through all the information that comes at you on a day-to-day basis and decide what's good and helpful information and what's just noise that you can ignore. Like anything, learning to think critically takes practice, but once you have a handle on it, you'll find that your anxiety levels will actually go down because you'll be a lot less harder for other people to scare. Pass on what you learn about the experiences of trans and queer people to others. Make an effort to use that information to gently correct any transphobic conspiracy theories that come your way. Talk to people about them, help spread good information that's backed by good science, and you'll already be doing a lot to make the world a safer place for trans people. You might even save someone's life one day. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. I am planning on posting another one soon, but like I said in the intro, I am on a train headed directly for burnout, so I'm trying everything in my power to avoid that, because when I burn out, I stop functioning, and I can't afford to do that, quite literally. I'm currently working on a video about ADHD, autism, and neurodivergence, and talking a little bit about my diagnosis and the process of that, and a little bit of my experiences. So I will be coming to you with that hopefully in the very near future, but like, again, no promises. Check out the links in the description below. I've included a lot of resources that expand on some of the points that I talked about in this video. So once again, if you've stuck all the way through to the end, thank you so much. Your support is going a long way to help trans and queer folk here in Canada and in the US. You are amazing. I hope that you're all taking good care of yourselves. There's a lot going on in the world right now, so I hope that you're all staying safe, prioritizing self-care as much as you can, and I will see you all in the next one. Toodaloo.